Hello, everyone. My name is Amin Moqaddam, Associate Research Scholar at the Center Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies, and I'm honored today to introduce you to Professor Javad Salehi Esfahani for his very, I should say, timely talk on the political economy of energy subsidies in Iran. Dr. Javad Salehi, he received his PhD in economics from Harvard University. He taught at the University of Pennsylvania before joining the faculty at Virginia Tech, where he is currently professor of economics. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, associate at the Iran Project at Belfer Center of Harvard Kennedy School, and a research fellow at the Economic Research Forum in Cairo. Dr. Salehi, he is at our center this semester. He's going to spend this semester at our Center of Iran and Persian Gulf Studies, so we are very happy and honored having him with us for the coming month. Before starting the talk, I would like to share another information with you regarding another event we are organizing next week called On Iran, Iran Changing Perspectives. It's an event that we are organizing in conjunction with Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. So we will have again Dr. Javad Salehi and other panelists. They will be talking about various perspectives from economic, cultural, urban, and political perspectives, trying to understand the new developments in Iran and the recent unrest that I'm sure you heard about. Please join me in welcoming Professor Javad Salehi for his talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here, and thank you very much for giving me 2 hours of your precious time in very mild weather to be here. Let me begin with the main issue that I am concerned with in this talk. We all know Iran is an oil-rich country because it exports 2.5 million barrels of oil every day, and which finances most of its budget. What we don't know is that more than twice as much oil and gas is being sold domestically with very little earnings for the government. As a result, the country is in some sense oil-rich, but its government is very cash poor. And I am interested in probing why that is the case and how that might be solved. This is a matter of national importance because the country needs to grow, and it usually grows with government taking the oil money and leading the investment process, and then the private sector joining in later, including foreign investors. And this has been the story for the last 5-6 decades of oil-led development. And these days, if the oil and gas that's sold domestically is able to generate revenue for the government can revive its investment program that has been dormant. It spends these days about 5% of the GDP, which is very little. It's not, almost not enough to keep up with the repairs of a fairly sophisticated infrastructure that Iran has. Now, this is also an interesting political economy question because the revolution had a very strong promise, which was to distribute oil wealth justly. The premise was that it hadn't been justly distributed, that the Shah and the elite of Iran were corrupt. They were stealing the money. Therefore, you needed to have new leaders, perhaps honest leaders, and the clergy seemed to present themselves as that kind of leadership that would be more sensitive to the wishes of the lower classes, therefore will take the massive oil revenues of those days and distribute it equally. And people were not terribly wrong in assuming that, because just before the revolution, the last 4 or 5 years in the 1970s, people who measured the income inequality, like the Gini index, they found out it went up by like 10, 15 points, meaning going from this Iran's stable Gini coefficient of 0.4 to 0.55, which is closer to what we observe in countries like Brazil. After the revolution, this process gets repeated. After every oil spike, you have rising inequality, which is kind of natural, but it's not as bad as before. The reason is not difficult to find out, because oil monies accrue to the government, and the government then, in mysterious ways, distributes it across the society. And usually, this distribution mechanism is sensitive to political structure. So political structure is of unequal access. There will be inequality in the distribution of oil revenues. Has the revolution fulfilled its promise? Yes and no. Inequality remains high, so something is definitely wrong. Inequality after the revolution dropped some, so from Gini of 0.55, if that means anything to you, dropped to about 0.45, and it's been around there between 0.4 and 0.45 during Ahmadinejad years. Because of the cash transfer program, that is one of the key topics that I'm going to raise, inequality declined some, but it's going back up again. The governments, various governments, did one thing right, keeping with the promise. They redirected public investment programs towards rural areas and poorer urban areas. So you had massive electrification, building up of health clinics, roads, schools in disadvantaged areas, which are something that the government or the Islamic Republic should be justly proud of, because the education of like rural women has increased faster than any other social group that you might consider. Fertility dropped, infant mortality dropped. Lots of good things have happened as a result of this redirection of public expenditure. But when it came to energy subsidies, which I'm claiming now is more than twice the oil and gas that is exported, they did just the opposite. Why? Because unwittingly, in a way, they allowed energy subsidies to accumulate, and these subsidies are highly unequally distributed. Compared to 1970s, today energy sold domestically is 5 times higher. So in 1970s, there was no reason to worry too much about energy subsidies and how unequally they were distributed. But today, there is every reason. Exports of oil, in contrast, are half as much as they were, less than half as much as they were in 1970s. So in some sense, oil riches that used to be associated with oil exports these days should be associated with oil and gas sold domestically. But they are not. If populist demands in the 1970s were about oil exports, today they should be about oil and gas sold domestically. So that's where the political economy issues come. Now, in this talk, what I'm going to do is to highlight a particular reform that attempted to undo what I just described, the challenge of unequal distribution of oil and gas. And then I want to try to explain why it failed. Poor implementation that a lot of people have pointed out to is part of the reason. Ahmadinejad, being a populist, he spent a lot more money on cash transfers, which were compensation for higher energy prices. So inflation was higher than it should have been. But that's not the only reason. I think the more important reasons, the ones that are meaningful in some sense, because you could fix the implementation, but fixing the political economy issues that I'm going to raise are much harder. So that's what I'm going to claim is the reason why subsidy reform has failed. And in particular, I'm going to point to the fact that in the last 39 years, the middle class of Iran has expanded and has become the majority. And they're very much in support of whoever has liberal, open, moderate, reformist politics. And this particular reform fell victim to this division between the populists, who are the bad guys from the point of view of the middle class, this rising, educated middle class, and the others, reformists / moderates / neoliberals, who are associated with political openness. So what we have now in Iran, as I'm sure those of you are familiar with Iran would agree, is polarized politics. And polarized politics in countries that don't have very strong institutions that guide their politics creates policy paralysis, which is what we have now. And you can think of Venezuela as a kind of an extreme case where they don't fix this kind of politics and it goes on, and you have people, it's like a tug of war where people are pulling on the rope, and maybe a bear is coming, but they're not able to put the rope down and go fight the bear to confront the real danger. And that's the kind of vision that I have, that I'd like to propose here for the subsidy reform. What you need in any kind of a country, developing country in particular, is a safe space for policy, where the tensions between populists, which are very strong in countries with oil, because the division of oil revenues rather than economic growth, which is a much harder challenge, becomes the center of political tensions. And neoliberal and pro-market policies that you need in order to have economic growth. If you're all concerned about distribution, the economy will suffer. One of the things that I think is important to recognize here is that, because I'm going to say a lot of good things about the 2010 Ahmadinejad energy reform, is that he didn't do it right. The reason being, he was himself an exclusionary politician, where before the reform came, the reform was much more logical than what he was doing before. He was giving cash to people. When you give cash to people, to your people, obviously they benefit. But it's a terrible way to run an economy. And that's what I mean by a very closed policy space, where monetary policy becomes hostage to trying to pay your people. I could talk about exchange rate policy, monetary policy, interest rate policy. You have very similar tensions, because all these policies have distributional implications. And if the society is polarized, even if a policy is bad and is benefiting you, you say, let's have it, because I don't want the other guys to have anything. So let me now jump into energy subsidies. Let's start with gasoline subsidy, which is the most sensitive, and is the one that is associated with all the riots, demonstration, protests globally. Whenever energy prices are increased, especially gasoline prices increase, it's like a signal, if you have any kind of grievance, to come out into the streets. Now, Iran happens to have one of the cheapest gasolines in the world. There's a whole list of like 150 countries from this website where I picked this up. Not surprisingly, Venezuela tops the list. That's what I mean by policy paralysis. Nobody should want to have a 1 cent per liter of gasoline. Now, Iran is 36, which is right there as the cheapest. And then comes Saudi Arabia, 54 cents. Iran's neighbors have higher, more expensive gasoline, especially Turkey, which is like 4 or 5 times. What that means is that Iranians will be trying to smuggle gasoline into Turkey. In fact, they smuggle it into both countries, Afghanistan and Iraq, where gasoline is more expensive. It's become a huge problem for Iran. The model that I would like to propose is Norway, oil-rich. It's a small country with almost nearly as much exports as Iran, so it's really oil-rich. But it charges $2 per liter, one of the most expensive. This is the most expensive. Hong Kong has one of the most expensive gasoline in the prices in the world. But I'd be happy with even $1 or $1.50, not to go to $2.
Do you have the data on price for parity? Like, what's the buying power of the people? So that, because Norwegians are rich, but Iranians are probably not.
Of course they're not, yes. No, they're much, much poorer. But when you're thinking about subsidies, you don't compare it to the earning powers. You compare it to global prices. You compare it to opportunity cost. And it becomes clear now, as I go on, that comparing it to people's pricing gasoline according to what people can afford is wrong, because you can always give them the cash. And that would make them a lot happier. And that's the whole point of this reform that I'm going to talk about. But before that, let's look at this distributional effect of gasoline subsidies. The distribution of gasoline subsidies is very much the distribution of expenditures. So this is from survey data from 2009. A quarter of energy subsidies go to the top decile. 2.3% go to the bottom decile. 11 times difference. So for example, every day, just today, the government will distribute $40 million, 80 million liters of gasoline with a subsidy of at least $40 million. Of these 40 million, 10 million will go to the top decile, 1 million go to the poorest decile. If this were distributed equally, if gasoline was sold at a reasonable price of about 80 cents per liter, according to this calculation, every household could get about $700 per year from gasoline, would be entitled to that, as opposed to now, which is getting $150 per year from a subsidy. And the rich people are getting 11 times as much, about $1,700. So that's what I mean by something that's gone terribly wrong in a government that is the inheritor of a revolution that promised people just distribution of all resources. Every day, they pay rich people 11 times as much as poor people in terms of subsidies. So this is obviously going to be a very big challenge for any government to deal with. And the problem starts with the strong populist appeal of cheap energy. Ayatollah Khomeini, just before the revolution, he had a speech in which he promised free electricity, free water, free transportation, and many other people came and said the same things. It was so bad that I would talk to my father. He would say, they're telling us, this is obviously hearsay, that if the revolution succeeds, every night they'll come knock at your door and give you cash. I believe that. I believe that people believe that. I don't believe that that was the message that was being sent, but a very strong distributive environment. You know, the revolution of Iran was not about bad economic policies that don't create jobs or cronies. It wasn't like Egypt's revolution. It was very different. It was like the money is sitting there, somebody is messing with it. If you get the right guy, it's like a cake that's going to be divided. You give the cake cutter to the right person, everybody benefits. Growing the cake was not the concern. So they didn't think too much about, are these people able to make the economy run? Well, oil was running out, I mean, through ships and pipelines, and money was flowing in. You didn't need a lot of expertise. All you needed was a fair person to divide this natural bounty. But free energy, like free education, is benefiting the rich more than the poor. The education part, the government nobody has quite understood now, but you look at the data, it's very clear who goes to universities in Iran. Free universities are benefiting the rich more than the poor, just like Virginia Tech, where I come from, is a public university, subsidizes, but mostly kids from high-income families in Northern Virginia are the ones who are able to beat the poor kids in the mountains, in Appalachia, with SATs and so on, and enter and benefit from the subsidy. Okay, so energy prices remain low for a long time. And you can see that here, this is Iran, lowest energy prices. This is Turkey. Because Turkey adjusted in energy prices, didn't have oil money, didn't have oil, so it had to. But it raised prices sufficiently so that today, per person in Turkey, gasoline consumption is half that of Iran. And Turkey is a better run economy than Iran's. It has 25% higher per capita incomes, exports to many countries, and very, very productive. Iran's has been lower than all the others. As a result of this cheap energy, this is what happened. Energy intensity of Iran's economy increased, while everywhere, including the United States, energy intensity declined. And this is Turkey's energy intensity. So Iran's energy intensity doubled. To produce $1 of GDP, Iran now spends twice as much energy as it did before. So this is the kind of thing that is you don't want to do, hurt economic growth. It hurts employment because cheap energy creates automation, encourages investment in capital goods, and undervalues labor. And of course, it hurts the environment, and it hurts equity. But there is a conundrum, which is why this kind of reforms are so difficult to bring about. And that is illustrated by this graph here. So what you see here are these bands, colored bands. They're the they're the subsidies going to different deciles. This is the gasoline that we were looking at before. But first look at bread. This is bread subsidy. It's flat, mostly flat. The poor and the rich benefit equally. So at least if it has other bad implications like obesity and so on, or diabetes, it does not have an inequality enhancing problem. The others do. This is gasoline, this is electricity, this is kerosene. Gasoline, electricity, natural gas are inequality increasing by factors of 11, 6, and 4. That means the ratio of subsidy going to the top decile relative to the bottom decile. And the key point here that is kind of relevant to this discussion, and it's also probably the reason why that picture of unrest is on the poster, although probably that was there to get you here. But it is relevant because as experience, I'm using Rouhanis' self-descriptions of his kind, tadbir and omid, hope and experience and sophistication. They didn't catch on to this issue. And for a long time, before coming to power, he badmouthed the energy reform proposal of his predecessor, kind of a visceral response. Ahmadinejad's done it, gotta be bad. And a lot of people came, it's like a chorus. And then finally, after 4.5 years, he proposed a budget that completely guts the 2010 reform proposal. And I think, what does it say? It says we're going to raise gasoline prices by 50%, and we're going to take away all the cash transfers, give it to the government to distribute it to the poor only. So a lot of people, especially lower middle class people who don't qualify for the welfare system, get obviously very upset. So I'm not proposing that as the reason why there was an urban unrest, but I wouldn't be surprised if this was on the mind of the people in terms of here's a government that doesn't seem to understand the distributional effects of economic growth. So now let's go to this program that I've been talking about. It's known as Ahmadinejad's targeted subsidy reform. He started talking about it in 2008, but by 2010, very late in 2010, he was actually able to implement it. A few months before that, it had been approved by the parliament, it had been tested in 3 provinces and so on. But basically what it did, it raised bread prices by 100%, by a factor of 2, and energy prices by various factors. Gas oil or diesel fuel was raised by a factor of 9. This is shock therapy. It's a separate issue that I'm not going to get into, whether you should have done stepwise or shock therapy. The key question that I'm interested in is the role of cash compensation to smooth out the impact, especially on the poor. First, they wanted to give the cash transfer only to the poor. Then they found out they couldn't find who the poor really are. You know, it takes a bit of experience to know that in a country of like 70 million, it's very hard to know how much money is in people's pockets, bank accounts, and so on and so forth. But they were not sophisticated. So the statistical center said, oh, we have survey data. That's, by the way, the data that I'm using. But it's on a fraction of the population. They said, we use that, and we use other stuff, and we can tell you with certainty who's poor, who's not. And then very quickly, it became obvious that that was folly. So they abandoned that. So Ahmadinejad stumbled into this program, which is now called Universal Basic Incomes, which is everyone gets equal amount of cash. The amount of cash was quite significant. In purchasing power parity, to address this issue of purchasing power, it was about $90 per person per month. In actual exchange rate, it was half as much. It exceeded the monthly expenditures of 2 million poor rural Iranians and 2.8 million in total. So that's a lot. It's going to help a lot of people. 40% of wage income of an unskilled worker with a family of 4 was being paid in an ATM on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. It was clean and efficient in delivery to 70 million people. There are very few welfare programs that have this low cost of administration and who are so clean in respect to corruption. Iran has never been accused of either of those two. People go to the ATM and get their cash. Who doesn't like it? The middle class, the government experts, and so on. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit now. First, let me give you a little bit of economic background. I actually talked about this, but I want to re-emphasize that there have been, from the beginning, 2 competing visions of the Islamic Republic. One was a distributive state, which is what I mentioned before. And it was built on a very exaggerated view of oil revenues. And if the oil revenues were high, this is a very important graph, by the way, for all Iranians to recognize, because this is the real value of oil per capita in the 1970s. For most generation of Iranians who are not happy with the current circumstances, before the revolution, which goes 2,500 years, is really these 5 years. That's their vision. They don't see the one before that, when Iran was kind of poor, 1950s, 1960s. No, they see these 5 years and they say, it was so great, why don't we go back to it? Well, you can't go back to it because the oil market is not going to go back either with you. So the best you can do now is, this is the next oil boom, where prices in nominal terms were higher, 4 times as high as this. But in real terms, per person, this oil boom is nothing like this one. So it's really, you can't now go back to that and saying, let's revive the promise of the revolution, which was to distribute all this money equally. There isn't all that much money to distribute equally now anymore. The other vision, which is the Islamic Republic as a development state that a lot of people had, like Bazargan, National Front, they thought the country was run badly, and you have to run it better. You need to bring technocrats, honest people, and make Iran into a modern economy. That vision is the vision that Rafsanjani had for a while. Khatami had, kind of. Khatami was in between. And Rouhani has now. But Rouhani and Rafsanjani are very similar in this way. And they're also very similar in the way they despised cash transfers. And Ahmadinejad is the only president since the end of the war who embraced fully the populist vision of the revolution and spent very little to convince people that there was something called a development challenge that you had to prepare for. You needed expertise, you needed globalization, you needed banking systems, you needed a lot of stuff that Rouhani later came to propose. Now, the middle class that has been rising, I think, has changed the balance. And I don't think Ahmadinejad quite realized that Iran of 1979 was a very different country than Iran of 2009. You can look at this from a data perspective. Here, what I'm doing, I think this is another very important graph that is good to know, get to know. We're looking at some 32 years of survey data going from here to 2016. And I'm dividing the population into income groups, less than $5 per person per day. That's the typical value. This is in purchasing power parity again, that the World Bank uses for defining poor in Iran. A lower middle class, less than $11, middle class, less than 44, and the rich, greater than 44. The really important thing here is this, from around 1997 or so. This is when Khatami comes to power, and the development state has already been kind of established by Rafsanjani. Fertility has come down. There's a lot of changes that take place in this period. But then here you see poverty declining. This is the proportion of people who live with less than $5 per person per day. And which section is growing is the middle class. Now they are close to 60%. At this point, this is before the sanctions came, they were about 60% of, or 56% of the population. And they are more educated than the poor, and they have a very strong say in politics and in policy making. The lower middle class, which is here, is kind of, obviously these are arbitrary breakdowns, but I'm interested in lower middle class because they don't qualify for the regime's immense interest in the poor, which has the Comité Emdad, there is the Behzisti, this is the welfare ministry, and a committee that carries Ayatollah Khomeini's name and distributes money to about 5 million peoples every year. So this charity of the Islamic Republic, which was the motto of Ayatollah Khomeini, besides saying you get free electricity, he said, we are for the barefooted. We are for the disinherited, right? Now, these are the ones that the government would probably recognize. These are people who are struggling, and they're trying to get to the middle class. The economy is not growing, and when energy prices go up, they drop, and they need support. Now, if you remove the cash transfers, they're going to lose because they are among the people who benefit less than the average from energy subsidies. This is the rich people who get most of the benefit from that. I think this change in the composition of the population explains very well the, at least to my satisfaction, why there was such broad opposition to a policy that I'm going to argue makes a lot of sense and a lot of other countries should follow. Remove energy subsidies, turn it into cash, not maybe all of it, but some of it, and give it to people on a uniform basis. All right, let me go a little faster. So the opposition to reform had several reasons. One of it was that inflation was very high. Again, I'm going to go very fast over these. If you look at this period, this is right after the reform, energy subsidy reform, inflation picks up, it starts coming down. This is monthly data because it's a one-time shock. It's a one-time shock. If you don't keep priming the monetary pump, inflation will have to come down. And it did. Then other things happened. US sanctions came right after that, EU boycott came, devaluation came, and inflation became very high. So it was easy for the opposition to this populist, what was supposed to be a populist policy, to say that we don't want this. We don't want energy subsidy reform because it creates inflation. It's amazing how many people did not realize that if you have cheap energy for a long time, when you want to fix it, if you ever want to fix it, you're going to have inflation. There's no other way. So inflation comes with having suppressed inflation for a long time by keeping energy prices low. So this seemed to be like a bitter pill that you'd have to swallow, but they used it as a reason for not having the subsidy reform. Then they said something else. Again, also this was popular in the press, never a research paper or anything resembling it was proposed, but that the subsidy reform actually hurt the poor, that poverty increased. I was one of the few people who was using the data to say that poverty was decreasing, and you saw it in a previous graph. You want to go back quickly to this. You see that poverty rates here, right here, are decreasing, and they begin to increase after the cash transfers become less and less influential. Here I'm looking at real wages. Real wages obviously are declining, but they're not declining as a result of the cash transfers or subsidy reform. Subsidy reform comes here. All these declines for the educated, college educated, high school educated, less than primary educated, and primary educated is coming earlier than that. If there's a decline, and there's not much decline here, it's coming from the crash of 2008. There was a global issue, and it was not related to cash transfers. But because it served the purpose to put down populism or put down distributive state, it became a very convincing argument. The most important argument was that it made the poor lazy. This was also a very powerful thing that went around, and Rafsanjani used this term, fostering beggars. Rouhani didn't quite use this term. I haven't found him saying that, but a lot of his supporters use exactly those terms, that we are not going to promote beggars. We are going to create jobs. That was their story. So juxtaposing jobs as opposed to fostering beggars became like, we don't like cash transfer, we don't like subsidy reform. As a package, we want to do something else. There was a story in Al Monitor that written by someone who should know better, saying 500,000 agricultural workers stopped working the day after the cash transfer program. No evidence has been proposed at all. There was a very top advisor to President Rouhani who was interviewed by a magazine to which I've contributed, and I told the reporters, when people say X, say, how do you know? So he said, people have quit their jobs because of cash transfers. How do you know? He said, I don't know, but the data is there. Where? In the statistical center. So actually, I did go to the statistical center to examine the data later, and I'm going to talk about that momentarily. was quite surprised that some people, you go to conferences, people simultaneously argue two things. One, the subsidy reform program has made people poorer. Almost in the same breath, they say it made them rich enough not to want to work. So which is it? You know, this is where you get kind of policy paralysis, when the dialogue is so poor that even policymakers get very confused. So the myth of the lazy poor is very popular, and it's been debunked systematically by economists. There is a famous paper by New York Times has an article on it. Banerjee et al., these are MIT professors, who examined 6 cash transfer programs very carefully, found no evidence of people working less. This is another article by Chicago economists showing no effect, no negative effect. So what we did in the case of Iran with a graduate student who's now teaching in Bloomsburg University, we took panel data, people who reported participation in the labor market and hours of work before and after the subsidy reform. And we looked to see if there was any evidence that those who received more cash as a proportion of their incomes, right? Because you give equal cash, it has almost no impact on the rich, so it can't affect their labor supply, but it has a huge impact on the poor. So this variation we could use to see if it explains the change in hours of work. None. In fact, the only positive results, significant results we found was that for women and for self-employed workers, there was a positive effect. And we attribute that, although we don't know that, we can attribute that to possible use of the money to improve self-employment, to invest in businesses, whatever it is that you do, maybe home kind of business. There are 2 very large misunderstandings that underlie this ideological debate. The debate has become very ideological. One is that what President Rafsanjani has been saying, which is justice is not distributing poverty in the society. This is a phrase borrowed from abroad. And it is true when you have to tax people to pay the poor. So you make some of the people poorer so that you can distribute poverty. So that makes a lot of sense. But that doesn't apply to Iran, because you're taking energy subsidies. You are raising energy prices that are harming employment, environment, everything, and distributing that equally. So where is the distribution? I mean, do you really believe that when rich people have to pay $1 for the gasoline, they are getting poorer? So in that sense, giving that money to the poor, you're distributing poverty? No, you're not distributing poverty. You're simply making the economy run better. Uniform distribution, in particular, has a great advantage. Because it doesn't do means testing, it does not create a disincentive for work. If there is a disincentive, it's this crazy thing that I'm poor, I have $50 in my pocket, I have millions of needs, like my daughter needs new shoes, my son needs that, my wife needs that, I don't care. The most important thing for me is to quit my work and enjoy life. That is the ideology behind cash transfers affecting labor supply. But if you are means testing people, you have what is called a cliff effect. As soon as you reach the poverty line, you're going to be disqualified, so you stop working. You never want to go to a point where 100% of your income is going to be taxed. You get another $1, you drop out of the poverty, and the government takes your $1 away. So these are the 2 very large misunderstandings that underlie this debate. What I think is, in the end, undermines this project, the subsidy reform, is a neoliberal reaction to a powerful state that has controlled the country in many ways, not just the economy, but people's private lives for a long time. So there's this great appeal of moving away from the state action or state control, but there are consequences. One of the consequences is rising poverty. So these are the poverty rates in rural areas and in urban areas, and you can see here that poverty rates in rural areas declined the fastest. This is because of cash transfers. This is even though energy prices have gone up. On balance, poverty rates have declined, but after energy prices begin to go up without compensation, this is Rouhani era, poverty begins to go up, especially rural poverty and small urban areas poverty. Now, you may want to think maybe this is connected to unhappiness or extra grievances in smaller towns and rural areas, which is what some people believe was influencing the latest round of unrest in Iran. You can also look at average per capita expenditures, and you see that rural areas since 2012 have suffered most. The one place where things did not do badly, people did not do badly, was people living in Tehran, where all things considered, the economy growing, cash transfers disappearing, the average per capita expenditures in Tehran have gone up. Now, relying on his middle class, I've got just a few more slides, relying on his middle class social base, which I think is interesting because we can look at some election data and get that, he decided after he won decisively in this last round of elections in June 2017, Rouhani thought that now he could do whatever he wanted, which is to completely dismantle the subsidy reform. This is a graph that shows what Rouhani thought was his social base. If you look at urbanization, districts where urbanization is highest, that's like 90% of people are urban, or 69% are urban. Rouhani's vote is higher than areas that are less urban. An extreme case is the urbanized district in Tehran called Shemiranat, the highest income area in Iran. Rouhani's vote share from 2013 to 2017 increased dramatically from 49 to 79%. I think this is what Rouhani had been seeing, but I think he also left other people behind in some sense. He decided to reduce in this new budget the amount of cash transfers and channel it through welfare institutions. This is another puzzling thing. I've mentioned several puzzling things from learned people in Iran. The most puzzling is this leading libertarian economist in Iran that's advisor to the major daily newspapers and journals. He advocated removing the cash transfer because they're so destructive and giving it to the government to give it to the people. Now, Hayek was turning in his grave to hear a follower of his say, don't let the ATMs give people money directly. Give it to the government. The government knows best, knows how to divide it. I find these things very interesting as the country tries to grapple with very serious issues. And in the end, it's going to be the lower middle class that are not going to qualify for the government poverty programs and are going to lose. So this is just two slides. Populism is resurgent as a result of the failure of the moderates to come up with intelligent policies. Just touting globalization isn't enough. You need to bring everyone with you. You need to educate the rich, the middle class, and the poor of where you're going and how it's going to be good for everybody, as opposed to saying what they did for the poor is terrible, we're going to stop that without much logic, and we're going to globalize. Even though there's a lot of evidence, including from Iran, that when you globalize, when the economy grows through globalization, the poor tend to lose. And they need some way of being compensated. The parliament has already said that there is going to be no increase in gasoline prices, probably for foreseeable future. They're probably going to suppress any other price increases Rouhani may have had in mind. So now he would like to reform energy prices, very much so, but he doesn't have the tool of cash transfer. He needed to have the two things together to be able to raise energy prices. Now he lost the cash transfer because he badmouthed it, thinking that he could just raise energy prices like he announced a month ago, 2 months ago, that he was going to raise it by 50%, thinking it would be very easy to do because of the voting patterns. But then he found out that there are people who will riot, who will protest against him. And that's where I think he is at right now, very fragile, vulnerable because of this policy. And if they do go through the welfare system and they promise to triple the amount of money, they're creating a huge disincentive for work. Watch, people come up with evidence that because of this stronger welfare system, tripling of cash to poor people is not a small amount. There is going to be an effect on labor supply, and we should be able to document that in future. So just the implications. I think this maybe talk was too focused on one program on Iran, but I want to draw in the last minute some larger implication. When you have distributive politics, which are kind of inevitable in a country that has a lot of oil and people know that is one way to get rich, policy making can become exclusionary very easy. You don't need everybody. You need your people, you need the oil money. You give it to your people and the other people can go to hell. That, I think, is the story in short of Venezuela. Just, we don't care about the rest of you. It's not like India where you need everybody, or China where you need everybody to get the economy going. Countries like Iran, Iraq, and Venezuela that have semi-competitive politics are particularly susceptible to this problem because you have some kind of a populist politics, and you can bring your people to the street, and you do this transaction of which policy benefits who by how many people come to the street, which is obviously not a good way to run a country. I'm going to stop here. I really appreciate your patience. Thank you.